I'm Dick Smith. We're going to talk about the events that occurred in this beautiful village, this beautiful historic Manchester village. This program will not be about the architecture here or the history of the buildings. It will be more about the events that happened here. We hope you enjoy the show. Let's start with some real action. April 19th, 1775, Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world. The revolution was on. To drive the British from Boston Harbor, the colonists needed cannon. So a small group from Connecticut came up to Bennington, Vermont to ask Ethan Allen to muster his Green Mountain Boys to capture Fort Ticonderoga, which had 100 cannon. So on May 5th, 1775, Ethan Allen's expedition came north from Bennington through Manchester, headed north out Manchester West Road, then out Dorset West Road, and then headed up to Fort Ticonderoga, about 60 miles from here. On the morning of May 10th, 1775, 5 days after he passed here, Ethan Allen captured Fort Ticonderoga, and that was America's first victory. But he didn't just come through Manchester. He recruited his largest immediate family with him, the Roberts family, John Roberts and his 5 sons. Also, he recruited Nathan Beeman. Nathan Beeman was the person who led Ethan Allen across Lake Champlain and into the fort. In 1777, Johnny Burgoyne, the British commander, went to the king and said, "I have a plan to end the war. I'll bring an armada of 10,000 people down the Champlain Valley. I'll recapture Fort Ticonderoga. I'll move south through Saratoga to Albany, and we'll cut the colonists in half." Well, that plan didn't work out that well. He came down on July 6th. The British did recapture Fort Ticonderoga, but the general there, Arthur Sinclair, evacuated 2,500 Americans, brought them down through Rutland, brought them right down here through Manchester Village, down to Arlington, and from there they headed west down the Battenkill Valley to the Saratoga area to try and stop Burgoyne from moving south. Arthur Sinclair, the general, would later become president of the Continental Congress. The next day, July 8th, the Constitutional Convention that was being held in Windsor, a town about 60 miles from here to the north, ended. And it ended with the signing of the Vermont Constitution, and that was the beginning of the independent state, the Republic of Vermont. In order to govern, that body created a 12-person Council of Safety. Because of the panic with the British here, that Council of Safety came immediately, raced down to Manchester, and held their first meetings. And where did they hold their first meetings? In the Marsh Tavern. And the Marsh Tavern was, the original Marsh Tavern is where the southern wing of the Equinox Hotel is today. From the Marsh Tavern, Ira Allen, Ethan Allen's brother, sends a letter to New Hampshire requesting assistance, an army. Within 4 weeks, New Hampshire responds and brings out a retirement General John Stark. John Stark brings 1,000 or over 1,000 New Hampshire militia into Manchester. In Manchester, General John Stark meets General Benjamin Lincoln. Benjamin Lincoln was an emissary who had been sent here by George Washington to try and bring the troops that John Stark had brought in, to bring them over to the Saratoga area. I just wanted to take a little side trip down Union Street from the Equinox because I wanted to show you that not only is this area a spectacular area for views and its beauty, it's also where history was made. I want to complete the story of 1777. At the end of Union Street, up in the Green Mountains, that big gash is known as Downers Glen. Through Downers Glen pours Bourne Brook. It's through Downers Glen that John Stark came with over 1,000 troops in 1777. Can you imagine the excitement here in Manchester with 1,000 troops coming into a town of only about 500, maybe a little more, almost twice the population of Manchester. Here in Manchester, it was a major confrontation. Lincoln tells Stark to bring his troops down to Saratoga. Stark says no. He defies his orders here. Instead, Stark takes his troops down to Bennington because the entire Northern Army supply depot was in Bennington, and that's where the battle monument is today. So Stark leaves, goes down to Bennington. There was then the Battle of Bennington, August 16th, a resounding American victory, and many think that was the turning point of the war because the French entered the war. Now can you imagine all the excitement that had happened here? 2,500 of Arthur Sinclair's troops came through here, the Green Mountain Boys came through here, 1,000 New Hampshire troops came through here, and all the settlers were coming through here, all in that 6-week period. In 1812, there was a fight between two Bourne brothers and their brother-in-law, Russell Colvin. After that fight, Russell Colvin disappeared. His body was never found. By 1819, the Bourne brothers had been convicted of murder, even though there was no body. Well, in 1890, a man appears that claims to be Russell Colvin. He had come from New York. Well, in order to verify that, they had to have a hearing. They had a hearing in Black's Tavern, the second floor. Black's Tavern was the original building there where the Equinox awning is. That hearing resulted in verifying that that was Russell Colvin. So the two Bourne brothers were set free. As it turns out, that became the first wrongful murder conviction in the United States. We just talked about the Colvin-Bourne wrongful conviction trial, but none of the events in the Colvin-Bourne wrongful murder took place here in this courthouse, because this courthouse was built in 1822. What makes this interesting is that there's also another courthouse down in Bennington. As it turned out, in the early days, Bennington and Manchester could not agree on which town should be the shire town, meaning the town that has the courthouse. So there was a compromise. Both towns got a shire town, became a shire town. And as it turns out, Bennington County is the only county in Vermont that has two shire towns, Bennington and Manchester. In fact, over the years, the cooperation has really increased, and just recently we had the Shires byway designation. And that's been a cooperation between Bennington, Manchester, and the towns in between, plus Pownell. This is an absolutely beautiful building. Another point is Nundy Bongarts in the 50s put up those lettering up there for Bennington County Courthouse, but this is a spectacular building. In 1832, Levi Orvis, the father of Franklin Orvis and Charles F. Orvis, Levi Orvis built his house here in Manchester. And his house is the northern wing of the Equinox Hotel. And if you look closer, you can actually see the front door. Right now, it's the chop house, an eating establishment, which is part of the Equinox Hotel. But the interesting thing about that house, after Levi Orvis moved in, his wife was apparently very concerned about mud getting on her dress and so on. So Levi Orvis, who was in the marble business, hauling marble and so on, he started to put out marble in front of his house on the sidewalk there to protect against mud getting on his wife's dress. Of course, like everywhere in America, the neighbors on either side started to say they wanted that for their wives and so on. And that was the beginning of all the marble sidewalks here in Manchester. And by 1873, I think, it was about 40 years later, there were almost 4 miles of marble sidewalks here in Manchester. And the Manchester Journal said there was nothing like that anywhere else in the United States. A lot of those marble sidewalks have been replaced with newer marbles. Some of them have been covered with mud and so on. But there's almost 4 miles of marble here. Now, we're going to talk about the building to the right, which was built about the same time, according to most records. And that is the brick building there, and it was originally built as a bank building. An interesting rumor about this building is that it was built as a bank originally, But when the bank was to open, it couldn't open because they found out that it had been robbed the night before. One of the successor banks also produced their own money here. They printed their own money. Later in the 1800s, Charles Orvis owned this building. He used the top floor for his fly tying operation. He used this as a store, the lower floor. He also used this as a post office. Then in 1949, Johnny Appleseed Bookstore was here. That was here for about 30 years. Since then, it's had many uses. Currently, it's the Josiah Allen Real Estate Office. I'm now at the Charles Orvis Inn. The original inn apparently was built before 1833, but was raised by J.M. Shattuck in the 1860s. In 1883, Charles F. Orvis purchased this and used it as his home. It was also used by his family as a boarding residence. It was also used as a dental office. But this is the wonderful Charles Orvis Inn. It's now part of the Equinox. In 1861, the Civil War was on. Manchester set up a recruiting office on the second floor of what is now known as the Equinox Shops. Many of the recruits trained right out here. The main recruits from Manchester were known as the Equinox Guards. There were also bands playing here. A lot of people in the band would become recruits and go down to the Civil War. One of the bands, in fact, was the Cornet Band. Now, when these recruits came here, a lot of them were from out of town. Some of them were put up in Vanderlip's Hotel, which at the time was the bottom two southernmost units of the Equinox Hotel. In 1862, the following year, tragedy struck Manchester. The Equinox Guards went into battle, the Battle of Savage's Station, and on June 29, 1862, of the 57 Equinox Guards that went into battle, only 7 remained standing at the end of the battle. This was a real tragedy to everyone in Manchester. In 1864, Mary Todd Lincoln, wife of President Abraham Lincoln, came to Manchester to get away from the heat and the War of Washington. What she didn't realize was that actually Manchester had been devastated by the war, as I talked about the Battle of Savage Station in 1862. When she came, she brought her 20-year-old son, Robert Todd Lincoln, and they stayed at the Equinox House, which at the time would have been these 2 units to the north, because the Equinox had not purchased the Taconic Hotel, which was the southern 2 units. So they stayed here. It was 40 years later, when Robert Todd Lincoln made his money at the Pullman Company, that he wanted to build his family home, the Lincoln family home. And he remembered his visit here, and he built Hildene. And today you can still visit Hildene. It's open daily. It's a magnificent 412-acre estate here in Manchester Village. And it was all the result of that event where Mary Todd Lincoln came and stayed at the Equinox Hotel here. After several years of construction and fundraising, the beautiful Soldiers Monument was dedicated in 1905, complete with a statue of what is generally believed to be a Green Mountain Boy and not Ethan Allen. The monument was built by the Fullerton Marble Works, which occupied the building by the railroad tracks in Manchester, now occupied by the R.K. Miles executive offices. We're now on the south side of the Soldiers Monument. This plaque is for all the veterans in the Civil War, and the first thing to notice if you're walking around here is that there are so many. Manchester was devastated in the Civil War. Of particular interest are the Cummings family. The Cummings family, many people say, was the greatest loss of any family in the Civil War, both North and South. They lost 7 members of their family. Most of them were killed that fateful day at the Battle of Savage's Station on June 29, 1862. We're now on the north side of the Soldiers Monument. On this side is the plaque to the Revolutionary War veterans. I just want to point out a couple of people here. The first one is John Roberts. John Roberts was the head of the largest immediate family at the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. The other person is Nathan Beeman. It was Nathan Beeman who led for Ethan Allen across Lake Champlain and guided him into the fort. And that was, when they captured it, that was America's first victory. We're now a short walk north of the Soldiers Monument here at the beautiful 1811 house. It was in 1905 that another event happened here. Mary Lincoln Isham purchased this house, and 25 years later, she inherited Hildene. Speaking of the Lincolns and presidents, William Howard Taft, as U.S. President, came to visit his friend Robert Todd Lincoln at Hildene here in Manchester. He also made a speech during that visit at the music hall, which is now unoccupied. It's down on Union Street. In 1987, I believe it was 1987, a great film was released, Baby Boom, starring Diane Keaton. And it's a very funny romantic comedy. A lot of the scenes were filmed here in Manchester, some in Peru, some down in Sunderland, and so on. It's well worth watching. But one of the more fascinating scenes was filmed right here. If you get the film, you'll see Diane Keaton standing right here where I am, selling her gourmet baby food to several of the local residents here, the extras, and you may even recognize some of them. It's a very funny film. With almost uncanny timing or coincidence, in 2011, Hildene brought to Manchester a restored Pullman car. It's ironic that almost 100 years before that, in 1912, William Howard Taft had visited Manchester and had visited his friend Robert Todd Lincoln at Hildene. Robert Todd Lincoln was chairman of the Pullman car, and now 100 years later, a Pullman car has come back to Manchester. Well, that concludes our episode today. I hope you enjoyed it. Our purpose was really to show you all the major events that happened here, and there were a lot of them, all within about 200 yards. Nationally known events. Ethan Allen came through here in 1775. In 1777, John Stark came through here with his 1,000 militia on the way to the Battle of Bennington, and eventually, which was a result in the loss at Saratoga. 1864, we had Mary Todd Lincoln stay here. We had 1912, we had President Taft come through here. Even 70 years later, Diane Keaton was selling her gourmet baby food in front of the monument. So a lot of events happened here, and I hope you enjoyed the show and hope to see you next time.